So in the previous chapter, we looked at infection. We looked at the process of infection. We walked through each step of what it takes for a microbe to cause infection. And so what we're going to look at in chapter 14 is also something we talk a lot in Anatomy 2 about. So those of you that have had Anatomy 2, this is going to sound very familiar of what you had when you get into the lymphatic system. If you've not had Anatomy 2, then this is going to be a little bit new to you, and you may need to spend a little bit of extra time with chapter 14, because what chapter 14 looks at is it looks at the host's defense mechanism, right? So we know in order for a microbe to cause infection, it has to be able to penetrate through the outer barriers of the body, and then from there to be able to withstand host defenses. Remember, that was one of the big steps before it could actually cause infection or cause disease. So it mentions as far as the host is concerned, we are very blessed in the way that our bodies are built. We've got protective barriers, we've got means of deflecting, we've got means of attacking microbes so that they don't get into our system. And so what we're going to look at as far as this chapter is concerned is we're going to look at both the non-specific and the specific defense mechanism. So just really quickly, some of our defenses are what we call non-specific. These are the ones that are present at birth. You could also call these innate or natural defenses. So you are born with these things, and they provide non-specific resistance to infection. So they just kind of help us deal with a lot of the things that we might come in contact with once we are born. But again, the key thing here is they're non-specific. They're very general defense mechanisms that typically deal with whatever we may come in contact with. The other part of our defense mechanism is what we consider to be our specific or adaptive immunities. So these are those that we acquire over time, and the way that we acquire these is we acquire these from exposure to the pathogens themselves. And so the adaptive immunities are very specific to that particular pathogen. And so these are things that may be an immunity that we develop because we've had that type of infection before, and now our body knows how to deal with it, or this is something that actually could happen because of vaccinations and those types of things. And so what we do when we start studying the defense mechanisms, and this just kind of gives you a quick overview of these, and we're going to work through these as we go, but it mentions on objective number 2 that our defense is divided into 3 separate lines. So we have what we call the first line of defense, the second line of defense, and then the third line of defense. Now, all of these actually work together, and some of these lines actually kind of overlap. So I need you to know that it's not like first line happens first, and then it stops, and then the second line takes over and it stops, and the third takes over and it stops. These are just 3 lines, but again, they kind of work together as a community in order to protect you. Okay, so the first line of defense, the reason it's called the first line of defense is because it's the first part of your body that a microbe would have to penetrate through. Like, so first line of defense, these are going to be barriers. So this is going to be any barrier that blocks invasion of a portal of entry. So if you think back to the last chapter, we talked about portals of entry. This could be the skin. This could be the nasal passageway. This could be the oral passageway, right? So any opening to your body, anything that acts as a portal of entry, the part of your immune system that blocks invasion there would be a part of the first line. Now, we do want to make note that this first line of defense is non-specific. So its job is just to keep anything from getting in. It doesn't target just one particular microbe. It's anything, so we call it non-specific. So the second line of defense typically consists of cells and the fluids that these cells produce. So a lot of chemicals can be associated with this. Inflammation is a big part of the second line of defense. Phagocytosis, we're actually engulfing and eating those microbes, is a big part of the second line of defense. And again, it is also non-specific. So the second line targets any microbe that gets in your system and tries to kill it, whether cells themselves or the chemicals that they produce. So then the third line of defense is the specific part of our immune system. So this one is the line that's actually acquired. So it's something that you gain over time. And the way that you acquire it, again, we already mentioned, is exposure to that foreign foreign substance. And so what happens is when you're exposed to a pathogen, it can allow your body to produce protective antibodies. And so those protective antibodies help create memory cells. And so you are able to, in the future, when you come in contact with that particular pathogen, your body remembers what that pathogen is, and it knows that it needs to get rid of it. And so very quickly, or hopefully very quickly, it targets that pathogen and gets it out of your system before it causes an infection. So the third line, very specific, and it's the one that you actually acquire over time. So what we're going to do is look at these in a little more detail. So this second objective here is really large, okay? So you'll see that you have a lot of extra room here because we want to make sure that you have plenty of time or plenty of room in order to go through each one of these. So if we come back to that first line, again, remember the first line of defense, these are the barriers, okay? So number of defenses that are actually a normal part of the body's anatomy and physiology. They're inborn, they're innate, they're non-specific. Okay, so you also can kind of throw these under that objective number 3, that the first line of defense is innate, it is non-specific. And so we take this first line of defense and you actually can divide it into 3 subcategories. Okay, so you have the actual physical anatomical barriers of the body, the chemical defenses that are a part of those barriers, and then we also include genetic resistance in this line of defense. And so the goal of this is to block the entry of microbes as well as any other foreign agent that could be detrimental to your body. So we call all of those things, and again this is a kind of an anatomy 2 term, but we call these self cells versus foreign cells, right? So the goal of this first line of defense is not to block self cells, but to block foreign cells. So anything that is not of you should not be allowed to get in. So if we look at the first subcategory, we look at the physical or the anatomical barriers. Obviously the skin is the number one that's mentioned. It's the outermost layer of your body, right? It's very tightly compacted epithelial cells. They're cemented together. They contain the protein keratin, which we learn in Anatomy 1 is a hardening protein, so it makes those layers very tough, very strong. But we also know that the skin contains sweat glands, right? So that's going to be part of the chemicals we're going to look at just later that kind of help flush things off of your body. Also in these anatomical barriers are going to be mucous membranes, right? So mucous membranes, they're called mucous membranes because they're membranes that produce mucus. So you think about areas of your body that have these. So we think about the nasal cavity, the oral cavity. We think about reproductive cavity, urinary cavity, right? So these are coating digestive, they're coating genitourinary, they're coating respiratory tracts, and in that coating, right, they're going to secrete mucus. They're going to secrete some chemicals that are going to have a flushing effect, right, so help us to get rid of microbes that way. Also, we think about mucus being very thick, right? So the mucus that these membranes produce actually stick to some of the microbes. They trap them so that they can be prevented from getting into some of the more serious parts of our body. So it keeps preventing them from getting into organs where they could actually lead to infections. So we look at the physical, we look at the anatomical barriers, just a quick picture that they show you here. This is on page 440. So again, we think about the skin, but we also think about a lot of the things associated with the skin. So we think about glands, we think about, again, nasal and oral and genitourinary tract as well. Okay, this just gives you a picture of some of the cilia that's actually lining your air duct. And so this cilia, there's mucus secreting glands in here, and those cilia beat and they help to trap things. So really good barrier that's there. Remember also subcategory here, and we've kind of hit on these already, are the chemical defenses that make up this first line. So we know that the skin produces some secretions, right? You have what are called sebaceous glands. Those secrete sebaceous secretions, or you could just say oil secretions. One of the things that we talk about in microbe in a lot of cases is that oil can change the pH of the skin. And remember, we've already mentioned that microbes are typically very specific to pH. And so if you drop the pH of the skin, then you can cause microbes to not want to live there, right? Other antimicrobial secretions that are produced, we mentioned, again, oil. We also know sweat is something that's produced. They mention, think about your eyes, like tears, your mouth, saliva. A lot of those secretions have enzymes in them, right? So enzymes that can break down cell walls, enzymes that can shut down around cell processes. So very important there. We also again know that your skin is high in sweat, which is high in electrolytes, high in lactic acid, and again that can drop the pH of your skin. So the chemical defense mechanisms of that first line, very, very important to blocking the entry for those. Again, they mentioned some other chemical defenses. So like with the digestive tract, we think about hydrochloric acid, very strong acid. It's about as low as you can get on the pH scale. Other digestive juices in bile, also very acidic. You think about the reproductive system, so semen contains antimicrobial chemicals in it. The female vagina is highly acidic as well. So all of this acid, all of these juices here, very good chemical defenses to block those portals of entry. But then remember, a third subdivision of the first line of defense was genetic defenses. So we know that some hosts are genetically immune to diseases, right? Remember we talked about the fact that some microbes are host specific, right? So they mentioned humans cannot acquire distemper from cats. It's specific to cats. Humans are genetically immune to it. In the same way, cats can't get mumps from humans because mumps are specific to humans, therefore it's not transmitted to cats. They are genetically immune to it. Remember, viruses are very specific to their host. So again, you think about, we know that they have that ability to mutate, but host specific there is an issue. We also know that sometimes humans carrying genes can make them resistant to other types of infections. For example, it has been noted that humans that have sickle cell anemia, so they carry the genes that cause sickle cell anemia, although that is an issue, it makes them resistant to the produce that causes malaria. So even though you don't want sickle cell anemia, if you have sickle cell anemia, there's a genetic advantage because it makes them resistant to malaria. So something interesting to consider there. So quick check for you, and that's the end of the first section.